When I look at PSI 40 years ago and look at it today, I can see some real differences. I think that as an organization over the years, we have matured a lot. I think we've learned a lot, hopefully by trial and error. A very major event for us was in 1997 when we changed our, was it 97? I think it was 97, where we changed our name from CHDC to PSI, Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute, and decided that that's who we are and that's what we're about. 2001 was also a time of real change because of the 9/11 situation, and I think after 9/11 we became dealing much more with issues of trauma, and that changed the direction we were going in.
Actually, when I think about PSI in the beginning, I think about something prior to the beginning, which was the Community Mental Health Act, which was accomplished in 1963. And that was also the date of the beginning of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. And that is sort of really the crux in the beginning of why this service became necessary. Clergy were not trained to provide care in the mental health field. And in that research in 1963, it was acknowledged that 60% of people turn to clergy first when they have emotional issues. And the clergy were not trained to respond to that need. So the Community Mental Health Act stimulated the response of churches and religious institutions to the need for this kind of service. And the training that began, really had begun in a fledgling way in the 50s, got amped up and enlarged at places around the country, and particularly here in New York at the what was called the American Foundation of Religion and Psychiatry in those days. And those early training programs are where the original leadership of PSI came from. They were trained there in the late 60s, early 70s, and began to practice in Manhattan in different churches. And then so by 1974, 75, the collaboration was begun between St. Bart's Trinity Church and St. Thomas and maybe one other church to put together an organization. And that was the beginning of PSI. That, in those days, it was called the Counseling and Human Development Center. And I opened the St. John's in the Village Pastoral Counseling Center in 1978 when I graduated from Blanton Peel. That center was freestanding and separate from what now is PSI until 1993, 92, when I became the executive director of this organization and brought that in as a part of the whole. So we grew from 2, 3 centers to 4. From time to time we've been 5, 6 maybe, but it's 4 stable centers that we've had for many years.
The story of how PSI came to be originally is an interesting one because it didn't happen, it happened in kind of a loose way, a lot of coincidences that led to the founding of this organization. What happened initially was that 2 people who had studied together at Blanton Peel, Dorothy Scoville and Steve Price. Steve started a center in 1974 at St. Bart's Church. And Dorothy Scoville started a center she called the Human Development Center at Trinity. And they had these independent centers going for about a year, maybe possibly 2 years. And then they decided they wanted to join together and see if they could make one center of the 2. And at that time, a third person, Charles Brand, who had started a center at Calvary Church, he was also an Episcopal priest and a pastoral counselor, decided he would like to join with the 2 of them. So the 3 of them started to get into conversation. And shortly thereafter, they asked me and Alan Chisholm and myself if we would like to join in too, because Alan and I had been classmates of Steve and Dorothy at Blanton Peel. So in September of '75, we had our first Wednesday meeting 40 years ago, and we decided to choose the name Counseling and Human Development Center, CHDC. So for the first several years, we were CHDC. But, it grew from there, and I think that by the end of the year, pretty much all of us had full caseloads. But that's when it started, and we've been meeting every Wednesday, except for the summer breaks, ever since. I mean, that's where we came. That's how it started.
One of the things that's really an important factor in terms of being at the Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute is the fact that we are, in fact, interested in the intersection of psychotherapy and spirituality. And so while PSI is indeed rooted in religious tradition and in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors and respects all religions without discrimination, we are also aware that while the churches and other houses of worship are experiencing a loss of members, people nonetheless are identifying spirituality as a very important factor in their lives. And so when people come to PSI, they can understand that the mental health professionals who work here will not be viewing their religious and spiritual concerns as pathology. They won't be viewing them as some form of neurosis, but rather as an important dimension in life. And the therapists at PSI are open to all expressions of spirituality.
Our experience at 9/11 made that profoundly true, that churches and religious institutions, spirituality-oriented facilities have doors open for people in those times of crises that are crucial. And I think PSI was right there in the midst of that, recognizing our own trauma, recognizing the assault on all of our senses, and the reality of working with people who were traumatized and profoundly traumatized. I think it opens a realization to just how traumatized we all are in the culture, and that the need for people who have tenderness and warmth and depth and listening and caring is vital.